Cypherpunks, Freedom and the Future of the Internet. By Julian Assange. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Contents. What is a cypherpunk? Chapter 1. Introduction. A Call to Cryptographic Arms. Chapter 2. Discussion participants. Chapter 3. Note on the various attempts to persecute WikiLeaks and people associated with it. Chapter 4. Increased communication versus increased surveillance. Chapter 5. Fighting total surveillance with the laws of man. Chapter 6. Private sector spying. Chapter 7. Fighting total surveillance with the laws of physics. What is a cypherpunk? Cypherpunks advocate for the use of cryptography and similar methods as ways to achieve societal and political change. Founded in the early 1990s, the movement has been most active during the 1990s crypto wars and following the 2011 Internet spring. The term cypherpunk, derived from cryptographic, cipher and punk, was added to the Oxford English Dictionary in 2006. Chapter 1. Introduction. A Call to Cryptographic Arms. This book is not a manifesto. There is not time for that. This book is a warning. The world is not sliding, but galloping into a new transnational dystopia. This development has not been properly recognized outside of national security circles. It has been hidden by secrecy, complexity, and scale. The Internet, our greatest tool of emancipation, has been transformed into the most dangerous facilitator of totalitarianism we have ever seen. The Internet is a threat to human civilization. These transformations have come about silently, because those who know what is going on work in the global surveillance industry and have no incentives to speak out. Left to its own trajectory, within a few years, global civilization will be a postmodern surveillance dystopia, from which escape for all but the most skilled individuals will be impossible. In fact, we may already be there. While many writers have considered what the Internet means for global civilization, they are wrong. They are wrong because they do not have the sense of perspective that direct experience brings. They are wrong because they have never met the enemy. No description of the world survives first contact with the enemy. We have met the enemy. Over the last 6 years, WikiLeaks has had conflicts with nearly every powerful state. We know the new surveillance state from an insider's perspective, because we have plumbed its secrets. We know it from a combatant's perspective, because we have had to protect our people, our finances, and our sources from it. We know it from a global perspective, because we have people, assets, and information in nearly every country. We know it from the perspective of time, because we have been fighting this phenomenon for years and have seen it double and spread, again and again. It is an invasive parasite, growing fat off societies that merge with the Internet. It is rolling over the planet, infecting all states and peoples before it. What is to be done? Once upon a time in a place that was neither here nor there, we, the constructors and citizens of the young Internet, discussed the future of our new world. We saw that the relationships between all people would be mediated by our new world, and that the nature of states, which are defined by how people exchange information, economic value, and force, would also change. We saw that the merger between existing state structures and the Internet created an opening to change the nature of states. First, recall that states are systems through which coercive force flows. Factions within a state may compete for support, leading to democratic surface phenomena, but the underpinnings of states are the systematic application and avoidance of violence. Land ownership, property, rents, dividends, taxation, court fines, censorship, copyrights and trademarks are all enforced by the threatened application of state violence. Most of the time we are not even aware of how close to violence we are, because we all grant concessions to avoid it. Like sailors smelling the breeze, we rarely contemplate how our surface world is propped up from below by darkness. In the new space of the Internet, what would be the mediator of coercive force? Does it even make sense to ask this question? In this otherworldly space, this seemingly platonic realm of ideas and information flow, could there be a notion of coercive force? A force that could modify historical records, tap phones, separate people, transform complexity into rubble, and erect walls, like an occupying army? The platonic nature of the Internet, ideas, and information flows, is debased by its physical origins. Its foundations are fiber optic cable lines stretching across the ocean floors, satellites spinning above our heads, computer servers housed in buildings in cities from New York to Nairobi. Like the soldier who slew Archimedes with a mere sword, so too could an armed militia take control of the peak development of Western civilization, our Platonic realm. The new world of the Internet, abstracted from the old world of brute atoms, longed for independence. But states and their friends moved to control our new world by controlling its physical underpinnings. The state, like an army around an oil well or a customs agent extracting bribes at the border, would soon learn to leverage its control of physical space to gain control over our Platonic realm. It would prevent the independence we had dreamed of, and then, squatting on fiber optic lines and around satellite ground stations, it would go on to mass intercept the information flow of our new world, its very essence, even as every human, economic, and political relationship embraced it. The state would leach into the veins and arteries of our new societies, gobbling up every relationship expressed or communicated, every web page read, every message sent and every thought Googled, and then store this knowledge, billions of interceptions a day, undreamed of power, in vast top-secret warehouses, forever. It would go on to mine and mine again this treasure, the collective private intellectual output of humanity, with ever more sophisticated search and pattern-finding algorithms, enriching the treasure and maximizing the power imbalance between interceptors and the world of interceptees. And then the state would reflect what it had learned back into the physical world, to start wars, to target drones, to manipulate UN committees and trade deals, and to do favors for its vast connected network of industries, insiders, and cronies. But we discovered something. Our one hope against total domination. A hope that with courage, insight, and solidarity we could use to resist. A strange property of the physical universe that we live in. The universe believes in encryption. It is easier to encrypt information than it is to decrypt it. We saw we could use this strange property to create the laws of a new world. To abstract away our new Platonic realm from its base underpinnings of satellites, undersea cables and their controllers. To fortify our space behind a cryptographic veil. To create new lands barred to those who control physical reality, because to follow us into them would require infinite resources. And in this manner to declare independence. Scientists in the Manhattan Project discovered that the universe permitted the construction of a nuclear bomb. This was not an obvious conclusion. Perhaps nuclear weapons were not within the laws of physics. However, the universe believes in atomic bombs and nuclear reactors. They are a phenomenon the universe blesses, like salt, sea or stars. Similarly, the universe, our physical universe, has that property that makes it possible for an individual or a group of individuals to reliably, automatically, even without knowing, encipher something, so that all the resources and all the political will of the strongest superpower on Earth may not decipher it. And the paths of encipherment between people can mesh together to create regions free from the coercive force of the outer state. Free from mass interception. Free from state control. In this way, people can oppose their will to that of a fully mobilized superpower and win. Encryption is an embodiment of the laws of physics, and it does not listen to the bluster of states, even transnational surveillance dystopias. It isn't obvious that the world had to work this way. But somehow the universe smiles on encryption. Cryptography is the ultimate form of non-violent direct action. While nuclear weapon states can exert unlimited violence over even millions of individuals, strong cryptography means that a state, even by exercising unlimited violence, cannot violate the intent of individuals to keep secrets from them. Strong cryptography can resist an unlimited application of violence. No amount of coercive force will ever solve a math problem. But could we take this strange fact about the world and build it up to be a basic emancipatory building block for the independence of mankind in the Platonic realm of the Internet? And as societies merged with the Internet, could that liberty then be reflected back into physical reality to redefine the state? Recall that states are the systems which determine where and how coercive force is consistently applied. The question of how much coercive force can seep into the Platonic realm of the Internet from the physical world is answered by cryptography and the Cypherpunks' ideals. As states merge with the Internet and the future of our civilization becomes the future of the Internet, we must redefine force relations. If we do not, The universality of the Internet will merge global humanity into one giant grid of mass surveillance and mass control. We must raise an alarm. This book is a watchman's shout in the night. On March 20, 2012, while under house arrest in the United Kingdom awaiting extradition, I met with 3 friends and fellow watchmen on the principle that perhaps in unison our voices can wake up the town. We must communicate what we have learned while there is still a chance for you, the reader, to understand and act on what is happening. It is time to take up the arms of our new world, to fight for ourselves and for those we love. Our task is to secure self-determination where we can, to hold back the coming dystopia where we cannot, and if all else fails, to accelerate its self-destruction. Julian Assange, London, October 2012. Discussion participants. Julian Assange is the editor-in-chief of and visionary behind WikiLeaks. An original contributor to the Cypherpunk mailing list, Julian is now one of the most prominent exponents of cypherpunk philosophy in the world. His work with WikiLeaks has given political currency to the traditional cypherpunk juxtaposition: privacy for the weak, transparency for the powerful. While his most visible work involves robust exercise of the freedom of expression to force transparency and accountability on powerful institutions, he is also an incisive critic of state and corporate encroachment upon the privacy of individuals. Julian is the author of numerous software projects in line with the cypherpunk philosophy, such as the first TCP/IP port scanner strobe.c, the rubber-hose deniable encryption file system, and the original code for WikiLeaks. In his teens, Julian was an early computer and network security researcher, before some kinds of hacking were defined in law as criminal activity. Subsequently an activist and internet service provider to Australia during the 1990s, Julian has also co-written a history of the international hacker movement with Sulette Dreyfus, titled Underground, upon which the movie Underground, the Julian Assange story, was loosely based. Jacob Appelbaum is a founder of Noisebridge in San Francisco, a member of the Berlin Chaos Computer Club and a developer. Jacob is an advocate and a researcher for the Tor project, which is an online anonymity system for all people to resist surveillance and to circumvent internet censorship. His focus for the last decade has been helping environmental and human rights activists. Toward this goal, he has published novel security, privacy, and anonymity-related research in a number of areas from computer forensics to medical marijuana. Jacob believes that everybody has the right to read, without restriction, and the right to speak freely, with no exception. In 2010, when Julian Assange could not deliver a talk in New York, Jacob gave the talk instead. Since then he, his friends and his family have been harassed by the United States government, interrogated at airports, subjected to invasive pat-downs while being threatened with implied impending prison rape by law enforcement officials, had his equipment confiscated and his online services subject to secret subpoena. Jacob is uncowed by these measures, continues to fight ongoing legal issues, and remains an outspoken advocate of freedom of expression and a vocal supporter of WikiLeaks. Andy Muller-Magoon is a longtime member of the Chaos Computer Club in Germany, former board member and spokesman. He is one of the co-founders of EDRI, European Digital Rights, an NGO for the enforcement of human rights in the digital age. From 2000 to 2003 he was elected by European Internet users to be the European Director of ECAN, the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers, which is responsible for worldwide policies for how the names and numbers of the Internet should run. He is a specialist on telecommunication and other surveillance, working in a journalistic capacity on the surveillance industry with his project Wiki, buggedplanet.info. Andy works in cryptographic communications and created with others a company called Cryptophone, which markets secure voice communication devices to commercial clients and is providing strategic consultancy in the context of network architecture. Jeremy Zimmerman is the co-founder and spokesperson for the citizen advocacy group La Quadrature du Net, the most prominent European organization defending anonymity rights online and promoting awareness of regulatory attacks on online freedoms. Jeremy works to build tools for the public to use to take part in public debate and to try to change things. He is mostly involved with the copyright wars, the debate around net neutrality and other regulatory issues that are crucial for the future of a free internet. Recently, his group La Quadrature du Net had a historic success in European politics, successfully marshalling a public campaign to defeat the Anti-Counterfeit and Trade Agreement, ACTA, in the European Parliament. Shortly after participating in the discussion that forms the basis of this book, Jeremy was stopped by 2 FBI officers while leaving the United States and was interrogated about WikiLeaks. Chapter 2. Note on the various attempts to persecute WikiLeaks and people associated with it. At several points in the following discussion, references are made to recent events in the story of WikiLeaks and its publishing efforts. These may be obscure to readers unfamiliar with the story of WikiLeaks, so they are summarized here at the outset. It is WikiLeaks' mission to receive information from whistleblowers, release it to the public, and then defend against the inevitable legal and political attacks. It is a routine occurrence for powerful states and organizations to attempt to suppress WikiLeaks publications, and as the publisher of last resort, this is one of the hardships WikiLeaks was built to endure. In 2010, WikiLeaks engaged in its most famous publications to date, revealing systematic abuse of official secrecy within the US military and government. These publications are known as Collateral Murder, The War Logs, and Cablegate. 14 The response has been a concerted and ongoing effort to destroy WikiLeaks by the US government and its allies. The WikiLeaks Grand Jury. As a direct consequence of WikiLeaks publications, the US government launched a multi-agency criminal investigation into Julian Assange and WikiLeaks staff, supporters, and alleged associates. A grand jury was convened in Alexandria, Virginia, with the support of the Department of Justice and the FBI to look into the possibility of bringing charges, including conspiracy charges under the Espionage Act 1917, against Julian Assange and others. US officials have said that the investigation is of unprecedented scale and nature. In grand jury proceedings, no judge or defense counsel is present. Congressional committee hearings have since heard the suggestion from members of the US Congress that the Espionage Act could be used as a tool to target journalists who knowingly publish leaked information, suggesting that the approach is being normalized in the US justice system. At the date of publication, the WikiLeaks investigation continues. Several people have been legally compelled to give evidence. Court proceedings in the trial of Bradley Manning, the soldier accused of passing information to WikiLeaks, reveal an FBI file on the investigation of WikiLeaks that runs to over 42,100 pages, some 8,000 of which refer to Manning. Bradley Manning has been detained without trial for over 880 days. UN Special Rapporteur for Torture, Juan Mendez, formally found that Bradley Manning had been treated in a manner which was cruel and inhuman, and which possibly amounted to torture. Calls for the assassination of Julian Assange and publicly declared WikiLeaks task forces. The grand jury investigation is not the only avenue of attack on WikiLeaks. In December 2010, in the wake of Cablegate, various active US politicians called for the extrajudicial assassination of Julian Assange, including by drone strike. US senators labeled WikiLeaks a terrorist organization and named Assange a high-tech terrorist and an enemy combatant engaged in cyber warfare. A 120-strong US Pentagon team called the WikiLeaks Task Force, or WTF, was set up ahead of the release of the Iraq war logs and Cablegate, dedicated to taking action against WikiLeaks. Similar publicly declared task forces in the FBI, the CIA, and the US State Department are also still in operation. Direct censorship. In an act of unprecedented censorship of a journalistic publication, the US government pressured Internet service providers to cease services to WikiLeaks.org. On December 1, 2010, Amazon removed WikiLeaks from its storage servers, and on December 2 the DNS service pointing to the wikileaks.org domain was disrupted. WikiLeaks was kept online during this period as the result of a mass mirroring effort, whereby thousands of supporters of WikiLeaks copied the website and hosted their own version, distributing the IP addresses through social networks. The Obama administration warned federal employees that materials released by WikiLeaks remained classified even though they were being published by some of the world's leading news organizations, including the New York Times and The Guardian. Employees were told that accessing the material, whether on wikileaks.org or in the New York Times, would amount to a security violation. Government agencies such as the Library of Congress, the Commerce Department, and the US military blocked access to WikiLeaks materials over their networks. The ban was not limited to the public sector. Employees from the US government warned academic institutions that students hoping to pursue a career in public service should stay clear of material released by WikiLeaks in their research and in their online activity. Financial censorship, the banking blockade. WikiLeaks is funded by donations from supporters. In December 2010, major banking and financial institutions, including Visa, MasterCard, PayPal, and Bank of America, bowed to unofficial U.S. pressure and began to deny financial services to WikiLeaks. They blocked bank transfers and all donations made with major credit cards. While these are American institutions, their ubiquity in world finance meant that willing donors in both America and around the world were denied the option of sending money to WikiLeaks to support its publishing activities. The banking blockade, as it has become known, is being conducted outside of any judicial or administrative procedure and remains in place at the date of publication. WikiLeaks has been pursuing major court cases in different jurisdictions across the world in order to break the blockade, with some preliminary victories, and the legal processes are ongoing. In the meantime, WikiLeaks has been denied income, has elevated costs, and has been operating on reserve funds for nearly 2 years. The banking blockade is an assertion of the power to control financial transactions between third parties. It directly undermines the economic freedoms of individuals. Beyond even this, the existential threat it poses to WikiLeaks exemplifies a new and troubling form of global economic censorship. Some people allegedly associated with WikiLeaks, along with supporters and WikiLeaks staff themselves, have had mysterious issues with their bank accounts, from account details to full bank account closure. Harassment of Jacob Appelbaum and Jeremy Zimmerman. On July 17, 2010, Julian Assange was slated to speak at the Hope Hacker Conference in New York City. He cancelled, and Jacob Appelbaum appeared in his stead. Since this appearance, law enforcement agencies have been running a campaign of harassment against Appelbaum and people in his life. Appelbaum has been routinely detained, searched, denied access to legal counsel and interrogated at border crossings whenever he travels into and out of the United States. His equipment has been seized and his rights violated, during which he has been threatened with further violations of his rights. His detainment and harassment has involved dozens of U.S. agencies, from the Department for Homeland Security, Immigration and Customs Enforcement to the U.S. Army. These detentions even include the refusal of access to toilets as a method of pressuring compliance. Through all this, Appelbaum has never been charged or told by the government why he is being harassed. In mid-June 2011, while preparing to board a plane at Washington's Dulles Airport, Jeremy Zimmerman was stopped by 2 self-identified FBI agents. The agents questioned him about WikiLeaks and threatened him with arrest and imprisonment. Appelbaum and Zimmerman are among a long list of friends, supporters, or alleged associates of Julian Assange who have been subject to harassment and surveillance by U.S. agencies, a list that includes lawyers and journalists engaged in the course of their professional duties. Warrantless seizure of electronic records and the Twitter subpoena case. On December 14, 2010, Twitter received an administrative subpoena from the U.S. Department of Justice ordering it to give up information that might be relevant to an investigation into WikiLeaks. The subpoena was a so-called 2703(d) order, referring to a section of the Stored Communications Act. Under this law, the U.S. government claims the authority to compel the disclosure of private electronic communication records without the need for a judge to issue a search warrant, effectively getting around Fourth Amendment protections against arbitrary search and seizure. The subpoena sought user names, correspondence records, addresses, telephone numbers, bank account details, and credit card numbers from accounts and people allegedly associated with WikiLeaks, including Jacob Appelbaum, Icelandic parliamentarian Birgitta Jonsdottir, Dutch businessman and internet pioneer Rob Gongrij, and WikiLeaks itself. Under the terms of the subpoena, Twitter was gagged from even telling them of the existence of the order. However, Twitter successfully appealed against the gag clause and won the right to inform the targets that their records were being requested. Having been told about the subpoena by Twitter, on January 26, 2011, Appelbaum, Jonsdottir and Gongrij, represented by Kecker and Van Nest, the American Civil Liberties Union and the Electronic Frontier Foundation, had their attorneys jointly file a motion to vacate the order. This has become known as the Twitter subpoena case. A further motion was filed by Appelbaum's attorney requesting to unseal the still-secret court records of the government's attempts to collect his private data from Twitter and any other companies. Both motions were denied by a U.S. magistrate judge on March 11, 2011. The plaintiffs appealed. On October 9, 2011, The Wall Street Journal revealed that the Californian email provider Sonic.net had also received a subpoena demanding the data of Jacob Appelbaum. Sonic had fought the government order and lost, but had obtained permission to disclose that it had been forced to turn over Appelbaum's information. The Wall Street Journal also reported that Google had been served a similar subpoena, but did not say whether Google had challenged it in court. On November 10, 2011, a federal judge decided against Appelbaum, Johnsdotter, and Gongrich, ruling that Twitter must give their information to the Justice Department. On January 20, 2012, the plaintiffs again appealed, seeking to challenge the refusal to unseal orders that might have been sent to companies other than Twitter. At the time of publication, the case is ongoing. Chapter 3. Increased communication versus increased surveillance. Julian, if we go back to this time in the early 1990s when you had the rise of the cypherpunk movement in response to state bans on cryptography, a lot of people were looking at the power of the internet to provide free uncensored communications compared to mainstream media. But the cypherpunks always saw that, in fact, combined with this was also the power to surveil all the communications that were occurring. We now have increased communication versus increased surveillance. Increased communication means you have extra freedom relative to the people who are trying to control ideas and manufacture consent, and increased surveillance means just the opposite. The surveillance is far more evident now than it was when bulk surveillance was just being done by the Americans, the British, the Russians, and some other governments like the Swiss and the French. Now it is being done by everyone, and by nearly every state, because of the commercialization of mass surveillance. And it's totalizing now, because people put all their political ideas, their family communications, and their friendships onto the internet. So it's not just that there is increased surveillance of the communication that was already there, it's that there is so much more communication. And it's not just an increase in the volume of communication, it's an increase in the types of communication. All these new types of communication that would previously have been private are now being mass intercepted. There is a battle between the power of this information collected by insiders, these shadow states of information that are starting to develop, swapping with each other, developing connections with each other and with the private sector, versus the increased size of the commons with the internet as a common tool for humanity to speak to itself. I want to think about how we present our ideas. The big problem I've had, as someone who is steeped in state surveillance and understanding how the transnational security industry has developed over the past 20 years, is that I'm too familiar with it and so I don't understand how to see this from a common perspective. But now our world is everyone's world, because everyone has thrown the inner core of their lives onto the internet. We have to somehow communicate what we know while we still can. I suggest not looking at it from a citizen's point of view but from the point of view of people in power. The other day I was at this strange conference in Washington and I met these guys with a German embassy badge. I approached them and I said, "Oh, you're from the German embassy," and they said, "Ah, not exactly from the embassy, we are from near Munich." It turned out they were from the foreign intelligence and I asked them at the evening buffet, "So, what is the focus of secrecy?" They told me, "Well, it's about slowing down processes in order to better control them." That's the core of this kind of intelligence work, to slow down a process by taking away the ability of people to understand it. To declare things secret means you limit the amount of people who have the knowledge and therefore the ability to affect the process. If you look at the internet from the perspective of people in power, then the last 20 years have been frightening. They see the internet like an illness that affects their ability to define reality, to define what is going on, which is then used to define what the people know of what is going on and their ability to interact with it. If you look at, say, Saudi Arabia, where by some historical accident religious leaders and the people owning the majority of the country are the same, their interest in change is in the zeros. 0 to -5, maybe. They look at the internet like an illness and ask their consultants, "Do you have some medicine against this thing out there? We need to be immune if this affects our country, if this internet thingy comes." And the answer is mass surveillance. It is, we need to control it totally. We need to filter, we need to know everything that they do. And that is what has happened in the last 20 years. There was massive investment in surveillance because people in power feared that the internet would affect their way of governance. Julian, and yet despite this mass surveillance, mass communication has led to millions of people being able to come to a fast consensus. If you can go from a normal position to a new mass consensus position very quickly, then while the state might be able to see it developing, there's not enough time to formulate an effective response. Now that said, there was a Facebook-organized protest in 2008 in Cairo. It did surprise the Mubarak government, and as a result these people were tracked down using Facebook. In 2011, in a manual which was one of the most important documents used in the Egyptian revolution, the first page says do not use Twitter or Facebook to distribute the manual, and the last page says do not use Twitter or Facebook to distribute the manual. Nonetheless, plenty of Egyptians did use Twitter and Facebook. But the reason they survived is because the revolution was successful. If it had not been successful, then those people would have been in a very, very grim position. And let's not forget that pretty early on President Mubarak cut off the internet in Egypt. It is actually questionable whether the internet blackout facilitated the revolution or harmed it. Some people think it facilitated it, because people had to go out on the street to get news about what was happening, and once you're out on the street, you're out on the street. And people were directly affected because their cell phone and internet didn't work anymore. So if it is going to be successful, there needs to be a critical mass, it needs to happen fast, and it needs to win, because if it doesn't win then that same infrastructure that allows a fast consensus to develop will be used to track down and marginalize all the people who were involved in seeding the consensus. So that was Egypt, which, yes, was a US ally, but which is not a part of the English-speaking intelligence alliance of the US, the UK, Australia, New Zealand and Canada. Now instead let's try to imagine the Egyptian revolution kicking off in the United States. What would happen to Facebook and Twitter? They would be taken over by the state. And if the revolution was not successful they would be plumbed, as they are now, by the CIA and FBI for details on who were the critical participants. Jeremy, it's difficult to disassociate surveillance from control. We need to address both. That's more my interest, the control of the internet, whether it is by governments or corporations. Jacob, I think it's pretty clear that censorship is a byproduct of surveillance generally speaking, whether it's self-censorship or actually technical censorship, and I think that an important way to convey this to regular people is to do it non-technically. For example, if we built roads the way that we build the internet, every road would have to have surveillance cameras and microphones that no one except the police could access, or someone who has successfully pretended to be the police. Julian, they're getting there, Jake, in the UK. Jacob, when you build a road it is not a requirement that every inch can be monitored with perfect surveillance that is only available to a secret group of people. Explaining to everyday people that that is the way we are building roads on the internet and then requiring people to use those roads, that is something that regular people can connect with when they realize that the original builders of the road will not always be the ones in control. ANDY, but some people don't even build roads. They put a garden out there and invite everybody to be naked. So now we're talking Facebook. It's a business case to make people comfortable with disclosing their data. Jacob, right. People were compensated for being in the Stasi, the old East German state security, and they are compensated for participating in Facebook. It's just in Facebook they are compensated with social credits to get laid by their neighbor instead of being paid off directly. And it's important to just relate it to the human aspect, because it's not about technology, it's about control through surveillance. It's the perfect panopticon in some ways. Julian, I'm quite interested in the philosophy of technique. Technique means not just a piece of technology but it means, say, majority consensus on a board, or the structure of a parliament, its systematized interaction. For example, it seems to me that feudal systems came from the technique of mills. Once you had centralized mills, which required huge investments and which were easily subject to physical control, then it was quite natural that you would end up with feudal relations as a result. As time has gone by we seem to have developed increasingly sophisticated techniques. Some of these techniques can be democratized, they can be spread to everyone. But the majority of them, because of their complexity, are techniques that form as a result of strongly interconnected organizations like Intel Corporation. Perhaps the underlying tendency of technique is to go through these periods of discovering technique, centralizing technique, democratizing technique, when the knowledge about how to do it floods out in the next generation that is educated. But I think that the general tendency for technique is to centralize control in those people who control the physical resources of techniques. Something like a semiconductor manufacturer is, I think, the ultimate example of that, where you need such order that the air itself must be pure, where you need a construction plant that has thousands of people in it who have to wear hairnets to keep every little skin flake, every bit of hair away from the semiconductor manufacturing process, which is a multi-step process that is extremely complicated. And there are literally millions of hours of research knowledge possessed by the semiconductor manufacturing organization. If those things are popular, which they are, and they underpin the Internet, then coded within Internet liberation is semiconductor manufacturing. And coded within semiconductor manufacturing is the ability for whoever has physical control of the semiconductor manufacturer to extract enormous concessions. So underpinning the high-tech communications revolution and the liberty that we have extracted from that is the whole neoliberal, transnational, globalized modern market economy. It is in fact the peak of that. It is the height, in terms of technological achievement, that the modern globalized neoliberal economy can produce. The Internet is underpinned by extremely complex trade interactions between optical fiber manufacturers, semiconductor manufacturers, mining companies that dig all this stuff up, and all the financial lubricants to make the trade happen, courts to enforce private property laws and so on. So it really is the top of the pyramid of the whole neoliberal system. NDY, on the point about technique, when Johannes Gutenberg invented the printing press, it was actually forbidden occasionally in parts of Germany, and that's the way it spread all over the country, because when it was forbidden in one area they moved to another jurisdiction. I didn't study it in all the details, but what I know is that they messed up with the Catholic Church because they were breaking the monopoly on printing books, and once they got into legal trouble they moved on to a place where it was not forbidden. In a way this helped to spread it. The Internet was, I think, slightly different because on the one hand you have machines that can be used as a production facility, which even the Commodore 64 was, in a way, as most people used it for other purposes. Julian. So, each little machine that you had you could run your own software. ANDY, yes. And you could also use it to distribute ideas. But on the other hand, philosophically, as John Gilmore, one of the founders of the US-based Electronic Frontier Foundation, said at the beginning of the 1990s when the Internet attained global reach, the net interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. As we know today, that was a mixture of technical interpretation combined with an optimistic impact view, a kind of wishful thinking and also a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. Julian. But it was true for Usenet, which is a many-to-many email system, if you like, that started about 30 years ago. To explain Usenet simply, imagine there is no difference between people and servers and every person is running their own Usenet server. You write something, and you give it to one or two people. They, automatically, check to see if they already have it. If they don't already have it they take it and give it to everyone they are connected to. And so on. And as a result the message floods through everyone and everyone eventually gets a copy. If any person is engaged in censorship then they are just ignored, it doesn't make any difference. The message still spreads through all the people who are not censors. Gilmore was speaking about Usenet, he was not speaking about the Internet. He was also not speaking about web pages. And while this is technically correct, the interpretation of his words and their long-term impact was to generate people who understood themselves as the Internet. People said, okay, there's censorship, we'll root around it, where the politician with no technical understanding thought, oh shit, there's a new technology that limits our control of the information sphere. So I think Gilmore, who was one of the forethinkers of Cypherpunk, did a great job of leading things in this direction, which inspired the whole crypto-anarchistic way of having your own form of anonymous communication without fearing that you will be followed up. Jeremy, I see a difference with what we describe as the spreading of technology, because in the case of the mill and the printing press you had to look at one to understand how it works, whereas now we are increasingly building control inside the technology. The control is built in. If you look at a modern computer, in most cases you cannot even open it to get to know all the components. And all the components are in small cases, you cannot know what they are doing. ANDY, because of the complexity. Jeremy, because of the complexity and also because the technology itself is not intended to be understood. That's the case with proprietary technology. Cory Doctorow describes it in his The War on General-Purpose Computing. Where a computer is a generic machine, you can do everything with it. You can process any information as an input, transform it into anything as an output. And more we're building devices that are those general-purpose computers but which are restricted to do just GPS or just telephone or just MP3 player. More and more we are building machines that have built-in control to forbid the user from doing certain things. Julian, that's built-in control to prevent people understanding it and modifying it from the purpose that the manufacturer wanted it for, but we have worse than this now, because it is actually connected up to the network. Jeremy, yes, so it can contain the function to monitor the user and its data. This is why free software is so important for a free society. And why, I totally agree that we need the general-purpose machine, but this morning when I was trying to fly here from Berlin the plane actually aborted starting. It's the first time this has happened to me. The plane drove to the side and the captain said, "Ladies and gentlemen, we had a failure in the electrical systems so we decided to stop and restart the systems." I was actually thinking, oh shit, sounds like Windows reboot, Control-Alt-Delete, maybe it works. So actually, I would not be totally unhappy to have a single-purpose machine on a plane which just does that and does that very well. If I'm sitting in a flying machine, I don't want the pilots to be distracted by playing Tetris or having Stuxnet or whatever. Jeremy, the plane by itself doesn't process your personal data, it doesn't have control over your life. And well, a flying machine does have control over my life for a time. Jacob, Corey's argument is also, I think, best described by saying that there are no more cars, there are no more airplanes, there are no more hearing aids, there are computers with 4 wheels, computers with wings, and computers that help you to hear. And part of this is not whether or not they are single-purpose computers, it's whether or not we can verify that they do the thing that they say that they do, and whether or not we understand how well they do it. Often people try to argue that they have the right to lock that up and to keep it a secret, and they make computers either complex or they make it legally difficult to understand them. That is actually dangerous for society because we know that people don't always act in everyone's best interests, and we also know that people make mistakes, not maliciously, and so locking these things up is very dangerous on a number of levels, not the least of which is that we are all imperfect. That's just a fact. The ability to have access to the blueprints of the systems underlying our lives is part of why free software is important, but it's also why free hardware is important. It improves our ability to freely make sustainable investments, to improve the systems we use and to determine if these systems work as expected. But regardless of freedom, it's also why it is important to understand these systems, because when we don't understand them there's a general trend to defer to authority, to people who do understand them or are able to assert control over them, even if they do not understand the essence of the thing itself. Which is why we see so much hype about cyber war. It's because some people that seem to be in the authority about war start talking about technology as if they understand it. Such people are often talking about cyber war and not one of them, not a single one, is talking about cyber peacebuilding, or anything related to peacebuilding. They are always talking about war because that's their business and they are trying to control technological and legal processes as a means for promoting their own interests. So when we have no control over our technology, such people wish to use it for their ends, for war specifically. That's a recipe for some pretty scary stuff, which is how I think we ended up with Stuxnet, and otherwise reasonable people suggest, while the US wages war, that such tactics will somehow prevent wars. That's perhaps a reasonable argument for a country that isn't actively invading other nations, but hardly credible in the context of a nation involved in multiple ongoing concurrent invasions. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Chapter 4. The Militarization of Cyberspace. Julian, I see that there is now a militarization of cyberspace, in the sense of a military occupation. When you communicate over the internet, when you communicate using mobile phones, which are now meshed to the internet, your communications are being intercepted by military intelligence organizations. It's like having a tank in your bedroom. It's a soldier between you and your wife as your SM Singh. We are all living under martial law as far as our communications are concerned, we just can't see the tanks, but they are there. To that degree, the internet, which was supposed to be a civilian space, has become a militarized space. But the internet is our space, because we all use it to communicate with each other and with the members of our family. The communications at the inner core of our private lives now move over the internet. So in fact our private lives have entered into a militarized zone. It is like having a soldier under the bed. This is a militarization of civilian life. Jacob, right before I came here I was asked to be a coach for the Pacific Rim Collegiate Cyber Defense Competition for the team of University of Washington Security and Privacy Research Laboratory. At the very last minute I was asked to be an advisor. We contributed quite a lot of time to compete in a cyber war event where SPAWAR, a civilian arm of the US Navy that includes pentesting services, who do offensive computer hacking as well as defensive computer hacking, played what is generally called the red team. What they do is they attack everybody else that's playing, and every team's job is to defend their computer systems, which have been given to them at the beginning of the event with no real foreknowledge at all. You don't know what kind of systems you'll defend, and it's not even clear how the points are scored in the beginning, so you just try to do your best and hope. Julian, are you sure that it's actually a game? Maybe it's not a game. Jacob, no, you just get a bunch of computers and you have to protect them, and they break in and they take over the systems. It's like a kid's version of Capture the Flag at a real hacker conference or something like that, and it's interesting because these guys have a lot of tools, they've written software. Julian, what's the point of it though, from the US Navy's perspective? Jacob, well, in their case they are just sponsoring this because they want to build tomorrow's cyber warriors today, and so, for example, I brought you a notepad from the CIA because they were recruiting. There was a guy there named Charlie from the CIA, and he was explaining that if you want to come and join the CIA, this is a great opportunity to work in the real world. And the SPAWAR people were there, and Microsoft was there recruiting. The idea was to train all of these people, all of these teams, to go on to the national championship and to be winners and to defend the nation, and then also to be able to go on to do offensive hacking as cyber warriors, not just cyber defenders. We scored something like 4,000 points in this game, which was the combined score of the second place, third place, and fourth place teams. We were actually still higher than all of them combined. Julian, yeah. Jacob, it wasn't thanks to me. My motivational quote was like, hey, it's always darkest straight before it goes pitch black, and I don't think I'm particularly good at coaching, these guys are really good. But it was interesting because the way that the whole thing was framed was in terms of war, so they would say, hey, we want to hear your war whoop. It's like, I'm sorry, what? That's what they were saying over lunch, for example, when we were taking a break from defending our systems. They framed everything in terms of attacking systems and war and cyber war and the greatness of this way of thinking. And interestingly enough, aside from the team that I was working with, I felt like there were a lot of people that were struggling, because they weren't teaching them to use the art of war. It was more like the sysadmin cup, people who defend systems, and it just felt disgusting. It felt really weird because there were all these people whose background is in war, and they come from the war perspective, but they're not teaching strategy, they're very focused on the rhetoric of defending these systems, or on attacking these systems, and they just had so much war in the way that they were really trying to rile people up into a sort of patriotic fervor. They weren't promoting creative thinking or some kind of framework for independent analysis, they were pushing a cog-in-the-machine mentality of someone who follows orders for the good of the nation. I had never experienced it before. I felt sick and most of my team had a hard time stomaching it or even taking it seriously. Julian, do you think that that's standard US Navy training, and they're just now trying to apply it to another domain? Is it a top-down US Cyber Command decision, an international strategic decision, by the United States? NDY, more like the Nazis who had those youth camps where the kids were trained. Jacob, Sie können das sagen, weil du bist Deutscher. You can say that because you're German. No, it's not like that. The US Navy's involvement is just because the US government is sponsoring all this stuff. They asked me to coach because they needed someone there to do this coaching, and I just agreed because I liked the guys involved, these undergrads. But really what it comes down to is that the US government is really trying to push getting people into this, and they're trying to push from the perspective of nationalism. It's a very, very strange event to be at because, on the one hand, it's good to be able to know how to keep your system safe and it's good to understand the infrastructure that all of our lives rely on, but on the other hand, they weren't trying to convince people to understand it, they were trying to whip them up into a sort of fervor in order to make them happy to do this type of work. NDY, unfortunately, the interest of the United States to keep systems secure is totally limited because they want systems to be vulnerable in order to take over control. The approach to controlling encryption worldwide has not been going as far as the United States originally pushed for around 1998, when the U.S. Undersecretary of Commerce for International Trade David Arons went on a world tour arguing for government access to everyone's encryption passwords. But encryption is still handled as a so-called dual-use technology, and its export in the form of end-user products to many countries is limited by law, agreed to worldwide in the so-called Wassenaar Arrangement. This might sound reasonable in the context of declaring countries and their actions as evil, but it shows the dimension of the double standard, as telecommunication surveillance technology is so far not limited by export controls. Julian, Andy, for years you've designed cryptographic telephones. What sort of mass surveillance is occurring in relation to telecommunications? Tell me, what is the state of the art as far as the government intelligence bulk surveillance industry is concerned? ANDY, mass storage, meaning storing all telecommunication, all voice calls, all traffic data, any way groups consume the short message service, SMS, but also internet connections, in some situations at least limited to email. If you compare the military budget to the cost of surveillance and the cost of cyber warriors, normal weapon systems cost a lot of money. Cyber warriors or mass surveillance are super cheap compared to just one aircraft. One military aircraft costs you between, Julian, around 100 million. ANDY, and storage gets cheaper every year. Actually, we made some calculations in the Chaos Computer Club. You get decent voice quality storage of all German telephone calls in a year for about 30 million euros including administrative overheads, so the pure storage is about 8 million euros. Julian, and there are even companies like VS Tech in South Africa that are selling these systems for $10 million per year. We'll intercept all your calls, we'll store all your intercepted calls en masse. But there has been a shift in the last few years from intercepting everything going across from one country to another and picking out the particular people you want to spy on and assigning them to human beings, to now intercepting everything and storing everything permanently. And to explain it roughly historically, in the old days someone was a target because of his diplomatic position, because of the company he worked for, because he was suspected of doing something or he was in contact with people who actually did something, and then you applied surveillance measures on him. These days it's deemed much more efficient to say, we'll take everything and we can sort it out later. So they do have long-term storage, and the main way of describing the industry's two chapters is the tactical approach and the strategic approach. Tactical means, right now, in this meeting, we need to bug the place, we need to get someone in with a microphone, an array jacket, or have GSM, global system for mobile communications, surveillance systems, in a car, deployed, able to intercept what people are saying right away without needing to interfere with the network operator, get a police search warrant or anything like that, no legal procedure required, just do it. The strategic approach is to do it by default, just record everything, and sort it out later using analytic systems. Julian, so, strategic interception is take everything that a telecommunication satellite is relaying, take everything across a fiber optic cable. ANDY, because you never know when someone is a suspect. Jacob, there's a thing called the NSA AT&T case in the United States, the second case, Hepting v. AT&T. In Folsom, California, Mark Klein, a former technician for the giant telecommunications company AT&T, exposed that the NSA, the U.S. National Security Agency, was capturing all of the data that they could get AT&T to give them. They just took it all wholesale data as well as voice calls, so every time I picked up the phone or connected to the internet in San Francisco during the time period that Mark Klein has exposed, we know that the NSA on US soil against US citizens was getting it all. I'm pretty sure they have used that intercept data in the investigations that they've been doing against people in the United States, which raises all kinds of interesting constitutional issues because they get to keep it forever. Jeremy, we also have this example of Eagle, the system sold by the French company Aimsys that was sold to Gaddafi's Libya, and on the commercial document it was written, nationwide interception mechanism. It's a big box that you put somewhere and you just listen to all your people's communications. Julian, 10 years ago this was seen to be a fantasy, this was seen to be something only paranoid people believed in, but the costs of mass interception have now decreased to the point where even a country like Libya with relatively few resources was doing it with French technology. In fact, most countries are already there in terms of the actual interception. It's the efficiency of understanding and responding to what's being intercepted and stored that's going to be the next big leap. Now, in many countries we have strategic interception of all traffic in and out of the country, but engaging in subsequent actions, like automatically blocking bank accounts, or deploying police, or marginalizing particular groups, or emancipating others, is still something we are on the cusp of. Siemens is selling a platform for intelligence agencies that does actually produce automated actions. So when target A is within a certain number of meters of target B according to their mobile intercept records, and target A receives an email mentioning something, a keyword, then an action is triggered. It's on the way. Chapter 5. Fighting Total Surveillance with the Laws of Man. Jeremy. So now it's a fact that technology enables total surveillance of every communication. Then there is the other side of that coin, which is what we do with it. We could admit that for what you call tactical surveillance there are some legitimate uses. Investigators investigating bad guys and networks of bad guys and so on may need, under the supervision of the judicial authority, to be able to use such tools, but the question is where to draw the line for this judicial supervision, where to draw the line for the control that the citizens can have over the use of those technologies. This is a policy issue. When we get to those policy issues, you have politicians that are asked to just sign something and don't understand the underlying technology, and I think that we as citizens have a role, not only to explain how the technology functions at large, including to politicians, but also to wade into the political debates that surround the use of those technologies. I know that in Germany there was a massive movement against generalized data retention that led to the overturn of the data retention law in front of the Constitutional Court. There is a debate going on in the EU about revising the Data Retention Directive. And why? You are describing the theory of the democratic state which, of course, does need to filter out some bad guys here and there and listen to their phone calls on the basis of a court decision with overview to make sure it is done in the proper way. The trouble with that is that the authorities need to act in compliance with the law. If they don't do that, then what are they good for? Especially with this strategic approach, democratic states within Europe are massively buying machines that allow them to act exactly outside the law in regard to interception because they don't need a court decision, they can just switch it on and do it, and this technology can't be controlled. Julian. But are there two approaches to dealing with mass state surveillance, the laws of physics, and the laws of man? One is to use the laws of physics by actually building devices that prevent interception. The other is to enact democratic controls through the law to make sure people must have warrants and so on, and to try to gain some regulatory accountability. But strategic interception cannot be a part of that, cannot be meaningfully constrained by regulation. Strategic interception is about intercepting everyone regardless of whether they are innocent or guilty. We must remember that it is the core of the establishment carrying such surveillance. There will always be a lack of political will to expose state spying. And the technology is inherently so complex, and its use in practice so secret that there cannot be meaningful democratic oversight. Andy, or you spy on your own parliament. Julian. But those are excuses, the mafia and foreign intelligence, they are excuses that people will accept to erect such a system. Jacob. The four horsemen of the infopocalypse: child pornography, terrorism, money laundering, and the war on some drugs. Julian. Once you have erected this surveillance, given that it is complex, given that it is designed to operate in secret, isn't it true that it cannot be regulated with policy? I think that except for very small nations like Iceland, unless there are revolutionary conditions, it is simply not possible to control mass interception with legislation and policy. It is just not going to happen. It is too cheap and too easy to get around political accountability and to actually perform interception. The Swedes got through an interception bill in 2008, known as the FRA-lagen, which meant the Swedish Signals Intelligence Agency, the FRA, could legally intercept all communication traveling through the country in bulk, and ship it off to the United States, with some caveats. Now how can you enforce those caveats once you've set up the interception system and the organization doing it is a secret spy agency? It's impossible. And in fact cases have come out showing that the FRA had on a variety of occasions broken the law previously. Many countries simply do it off law with no legislative cover at all. So we're sort of lucky if, like in the Swedish example, they decided that for their own protection from prosecution they want to go legal by changing the law. And that's the case for most countries. There is bulk interception occurring, and when there is a legislative proposal it is to protect the ass of those who are doing it. This technology is very complex. For example, in the debate in Australia and the UK about proposed legislation to intercept all metadata, most people do not understand the value of metadata or even the word itself. Intercepting all metadata means you have to build a system that physically intercepts all data and then throws everything but the metadata away. But such a system cannot be trusted. There's no way to determine whether it is in fact intercepting and storing all data without having highly skilled engineers with authorization to go in and check out precisely what is going on, and there's no political will to grant access. The problem is getting worse because complexity and secrecy are a toxic mix. Hidden by complexity. Hidden by secrecy. Unaccountability is built in. It is a feature. It is dangerous by design. Jeremy, I'm not saying that the policy approach can work. I'm saying that this is the theory of how a democratic system would function, and indeed, even within this theory you have the secret services that are allowed to go beyond what is the rule for standard police forces and investigators. So even if we frame the behavior of the standard investigators properly, there would be other people who would be able to use those technologies. But there is a real question of whether or not we should regulate the fact of just buying and owning those technologies as opposed to regulating the use of them. Julian, this is the bulk interception kits that can intercept half a country or a city. Jeremy, yes. Like a nuclear weapon, you cannot sell a nuclear weapon easily, and some countries may want to build one but have problems. When we talk about weapons systems, it's the technology that is regulated and not the use that is made of it. I think the debate might be about whether or not these technologies should be considered as war. Jacob, it depends. When it is weapons, and there is no question that surveillance equipment is a weapon in places like Syria or Libya, they specifically use it to target people politically. The French company, Amesys, targeted people in the United Kingdom using French equipment that would be illegal to run in France, and they sold it knowingly. And they'd never do that, right? Jacob, well, Amesys were caught with their own internal documents in the spy files. If we're going to talk about it in terms of weapons, we have to remember it is not like selling a country a truck. It's like selling a country a truck, a mechanic and a team that goes in the truck that selectively targets people and then shoots them. Julian, it's like selling it a whole army of trucks. It's interesting that cryptography is regulated. There's the Wassenaar Arrangement, which applies internationally, meaning you cannot export encryption technology, which helps to protect against surveillance technology, to those countries declared evil or, for whatever reason, problematic. But if you are dealing surveillance equipment, you can sell that internationally. There are no export restrictions on that. The reason, I would say, is simply because even the democratically run governments have a self-interest, which is to control. And even if you're dealing with evil countries and you bring them surveillance equipment to do evil things, you will benefit, because you will learn what they are listening to, what are they afraid of, who are the most important people in the country opposing the government, organizing political events and so on. So you will be able to predict future happenings, to sponsor actions and so on. Here we are in the very dirty game of what is happening between countries, and that's the reality of why surveillance systems are not regulated. Julian, I want to explore this analogy of mass surveillance being a weapon of mass destruction. It was a fact of physics that it was possible to make an atomic bomb, and when an atomic bomb was made, then geopolitics changed, and life for many people changed in different ways, some positive perhaps, and others on the brink of total apocalypse. A regulatory movement applied controls, and so far those controls have, with the exception of Japan, saved us from nuclear war. But it's easy to tell when such weapons are used and when they are not. With the increase in the sophistication and the reduction of the cost of bulk surveillance that has happened over the past 10 years, we're now at a stage where the human population is doubling every 25 years or so, but the capacity of surveillance is doubling every 18 months. The surveillance curve is dominating the population curve. There is no direct escape. We're now at the stage where just $10 million can buy you a unit to permanently store the mass intercepts of a medium-sized country. So I wonder if we need an equivalent response. This really is a big threat to democracy and to freedom all around the world that needs a response, like the threat of atomic war needed a mass response, to try and control it, while we still can. And why? I was seeing in Libya how the democratic movement ran into the surveillance stations, they took records, they provided evidence that Western companies supported the Gaddafi regime in suppressing political actions, And then the new government took over exactly these facilities, which are now operating in full service again. So while I do agree that it would be a good idea to control this technology, I am a bit skeptical about the interests of citizens against the interests of people in power. I wouldn't even call it governments necessarily, because whoever has the ability to listen to all the phone calls has the ability to do things. This is about stock rates also. Economically, you can benefit a lot if you know what's going on. Julian, where countries have legislation as to what the targets of their major electronic spy agencies are supposed to be, agencies like the NSA in the United States, GCHQ, Government Communications Headquarters, in the United Kingdom, the DSD, Defence Signals Directorate. In Australia, they have changed that legislation to include economic intelligence. For example, say Australia and the US are vying for a wheat deal, they snoop on all the people who are involved in the deal. This has been around for a long time now, at least 10 years in public, but it is granted because people are doing it anyway. It started with arms deals, where you have companies like Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, and Northrop doing arms deals, and also being involved in building mass interception systems because these groups are close at a patronage level. They got favors from their friends and covered arms deal intercepts under national security criteria. But now it applies to anything that could economically benefit a country, which is almost everything. Jacob, a good analogy that some people in the Chaos Communication Congress brought up in December 2011 was the concept of treating surveillance technology, especially tactical surveillance technology but also strategic surveillance technology, like landmines. I think that's a very powerful thing. Just because it's possible doesn't mean that it's inevitable that we will go down this path, and it doesn't mean that we have to get all the way to the point of every person being monitored. There are some economic incentives that are against us though. For example, someone explained to me that the way that the Norwegian telephone system used to work is such that it would essentially run a meter which, depending on how far away your call, would run faster or slower. But it was not legal for the Norwegian telephone company to store or to keep a ledger of the actual metadata about the call you made, such as the number you dialed, specifically because of privacy concerns surrounding the Second World War. So it is possible to build that same technology in a way that is privacy-friendly but still allows for a market-based approach, which still allows for economic contributions. However, we cannot win, for example, with GSM, mobile, technologies. At the moment, the way that these systems are set up, not just in terms of billing but in terms of the architecture, means they have no location privacy, they have no content privacy. Julian, a mobile phone is a tracking device that also makes calls. Jacob, exactly. For example, if we're talking about everybody in the third world being spied on, realistically what does that mean? It means their telephone systems, which are their link to the rest of the world, are spy devices when someone chooses to use the data collected in that way. And why? I saw African countries are getting a whole internet infrastructure, including fiber optic cable and backbone switches, as a gift from the Chinese. Jacob, as a ZTE gift or something like that? And why? Yes, and of course the Chinese have an interest in the data, so they don't need to be paid back in money, they take it in data, the new currency. Chapter 6. Private Sector Spying. Jeremy. State-sponsored surveillance is indeed a major issue which challenges the very structure of all democracies and the way they function, but there is also private surveillance and potentially private mass collection of data. Just look at Google. If you're a standard Google user, Google knows who you're communicating with, who you know, what you're researching, potentially your sexual orientation, and your religious and philosophical beliefs. ANDY, it knows more about you than you know yourself. Jeremy, more than your mother and maybe more than yourself. Google knows when you're online and when you're not. ANDY, do you know what you looked for 2 years, 3 days, and 4 hours ago? You don't know, Google knows. Jeremy, actually, I try not to use Google anymore for these very reasons. Jacob, it's like the kill your television of the 21st century. Effective protest except the network effect prevents your protest from working. Kill your television, man. Jeremy, well, it's not a protest, it is more my personal way of seeing things. And why? I watched these beautiful movies of people throwing their televisions out of 3-story houses. Jeremy, it's not only the state-sponsored surveillance, it's the question of privacy, the way data is being handled by third parties and the knowledge that people have of what is being done with the data. I don't use Facebook, so I don't know much about it. But now with Facebook you see the behavior of users who are very happy to hand out any kind of personal data, and can you blame people for not knowing where the limit is between privacy and publicity? A few years ago, before digital technologies, people who had a public life were either in show business, politics, or journalism, and now everybody has the potential for public life by clicking a publish button. Publish means make something public, it means handing out access to this data to the rest of the world, and, of course, when you see teenagers sending pictures of themselves drunk or whatever, they may not have this vision that it means the whole of the rest of the world, potentially for a very, very long period of time. Facebook makes its business by blurring this line between privacy, friends, and publicity. And it is even storing the data when you think that it is only meant for your friends and the people you love. So whatever the degree of publicity that you intend your data to be under, when you click publish on Facebook you give it to Facebook first, and then they give access to some other Facebook users after. Julian, even this line between government and corporation is blurred. If you look at the expansion in the military contractor sector in the West over the past 10 years, the NSA, which was the biggest spy agency in the world, had 10 primary contractors on its books that it worked with. 2 years ago it had over 1,000. So there is a smearing out of the border between what is government and what is the private sector. Jeremy, and it can be argued that the US spying agencies have access to all of Google's stored data. Julian, but they do. Jeremy, and all of Facebook's data, so in a way Facebook and Google may be extensions of these agencies. Julian, do you have a Google subpoena, Jake? Was a subpoena sent to Google to hand over information related to your Google account? WikiLeaks got subpoenas to our California domain name registrar Dynadot, which is where the wikileaks.org registration is made. They were subpoenas from the secret ongoing grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks, asking for financial records, login records, etc., which it gave them. Jacob, the Wall Street Journal reported that Twitter and Google and Sonic.net, 3 services that I use or have used in the past, each received a 2703D notice, which is this unusual form of secret subpoena. Julian, under the Patriot Act. Jacob, no. This is the Stored Communications Act, essentially. The Wall Street Journal is saying that each of these services claims that the government wanted the metadata, and the government asserted it has the right to do this without a warrant. There's an ongoing legal case about the government's right to keep its tactics secret, not only from the public, but from court records. I read the Wall Street Journal and found out like everyone else. Julian, so Google sucked up to the US government in its grand jury investigation into WikiLeaks when the government subpoenaed your records, not a conventional subpoena, but this special sort of intelligence subpoena. But the news came out earlier in 2011 that Twitter had been served a number of subpoenas, from the same grand jury, but Twitter fought to be able to notify the people whose accounts were subpoenaed for the gag order to be lifted. I don't have a Twitter account, so I didn't get one, but my name and Bradley Manning's name were on all the subpoenas as the information that was being searched for. Jake, you had a Twitter account, so Twitter received a subpoena in relation to you. Google also received a subpoena, but didn't fight to make it public. Jacob, allegedly. That's what I read in the Wall Street Journal. I might not be even allowed to reference it except for in connection to the Wall Street Journal. Julian, is it because these orders also have a gag component? That has been found to be unconstitutional, hasn't it? Jacob, maybe not. For the Twitter case, it is public that we lost the motion for a stay where we said that disclosing this data to the government would do irreparable harm as they can never forget this data once they receive it. They said, yeah well, your stay is denied, Twitter must disclose this data. We're in the process of appeal, specifically about the secrecy of docketing, and I can't talk about that, but as it stands right now, the court said that on the internet you have no expectation of privacy when you willingly reveal information to a third party, and, by the way, everyone on the internet is a third party. Julian, even if the organization like Facebook or Twitter says that it will keep the information private. Jacob, for sure. And this is the blurring of the state and corporation. This is actually probably the most important thing to consider here, that the NSA and Google have a partnership in cybersecurity for US national defense reasons. ANDY, whatever cybersecurity means in this context. That's a wide term. Jacob, They are trying to exempt everything from the Freedom of Information Act and to keep it secret. Then the US government also asserts it has the right to send an administrative subpoena, which has a lower bar than a search warrant, where the third party is gagged from telling you about it, and you have no right to fight because it is the third party that is directly involved, and the third party has no constitutional grounds to protect your data either. Julian, the third party being Twitter or Facebook or your ISP. Jacob, or anyone. They said it was a one-to-one map with banking privacy and with dialing a telephone. You willingly disclose the number to the phone company by using it. You knew that, right? By using the telephone you obviously are saying, I have no expectation of privacy, when typing those numbers. There is even less explicit connection to the machine. People don't understand how the internet works, they don't understand telephone networks either, but courts have consistently ruled that this is the case, and in our Twitter case so far, which unfortunately I can't really talk about because I don't actually live in a free country, they assert essentially the same thing. It's absolute madness to imagine that we give up all of our personal data to these companies, and then the companies have essentially become privatized secret police. And, in the case of Facebook, we even have democratized surveillance. Instead of paying people off the way the Stasi did in East Germany, we reward them as a culture. They get laid now. They report on their friends and then, hey, so-and-so got engaged, oh, so-and-so broke up, oh, I know who to call now. NDY, there were people who were able to pressure Facebook to hand out all the data stored about them under European data protection law, and the smallest amount of data was 350 megabytes, the biggest one was around 800 megabytes. The interesting thing is the database structure of Facebook has been disclosed with this act. Every time you log in the IP number and everything gets stored, every click you make, every time, also the amount of times you stay on a page so they can assume you like it, you don't like it and so on. But this disclosed that the key identifier of the database structure was the word target. They don't call these people subscribers or users or whatever, they call them targets, to which you could say, okay, that's a marketing term. Julian, but it was internally private. And why, yes, but in a military sense it could also be target, or it could be in an intelligence sense target. So it is just as a matter of the circumstances in which the data is being used. Julian, okay. That's what's so scary about it. And why, I think that is very helpful. We used to say with Facebook that the user is not actually the customer. The Facebook user is actually the product, and the real customer is the advertising companies. That's the least paranoid, most harmless explanation of what's going on there. But the problem is you can hardly blame a company for complying with the laws of the country. It's called normal, and it's called criminal if companies don't comply with the laws of the country. So it's a little bit of a hard thing to say, hey, they're complying with the law. What kind of accusation is that? Jacob, no, there is something I have to dispute about that. If you build a system that logs everything about a person and you know that you live in a country with laws that will force the government to give that up, then maybe you shouldn't build that kind of system. And this is the difference between a privacy by policy and a privacy by design approach to creating secure systems. When you're trying to target people and you know that you live in a country that explicitly targets people, then if Facebook puts its servers in Gaddafi's Libya or puts them in Assad's Syria, that would be absolutely negligent. And yet none of the national security letters that went out, I think last year or 2 years ago, were for terrorism. Like, 250,000 of them were used for everything else, but not terrorism. So knowing that's reality, these companies have some serious ethical liability that stems from the fact that they're building these systems and they've made the economic choice to basically sell their users out. And this isn't even a technical thing. This isn't about technology at all, it's about economics. They have decided that it is more important to collaborate with the state and to sell out their users and to violate their privacy and to be a part of the system of control, to be paid back for being a part of the surveillance culture, to be part of the culture of control than to be resistant to it, and so they become a part of it. They are complicit and liable. And why? Ethical liability is not exactly a major selling point right now, huh? Chapter 7. Fighting total surveillance with the laws of physics. Jeremy, a question that may arise at this stage is what is the solution, either for an individual user or for society as a whole? There are technical solutions, decentralized services, everybody hosting their own data, encrypted data, everybody trusting providers close to them that help them with encrypted data services, and so on. And there are the policy options that we have discussed. I'm not sure that at this stage in time that we can answer the question of whether one of the two approaches is the best. I think we have to develop the two approaches in parallel. We need to have free software that everybody can understand, everybody can modify, and everybody can scrutinize in order to be sure of what it is doing. I think free software is one of the bases for a free online society, in order to have the potential to always control the machine and not let the machine control you. We need to have strong cryptography to be sure that when you want your data to be read only by yourself, nobody else can read it. We need communication tools like Tor, or like the cryptophone, to be able to communicate only with the people you want to communicate with. But the power of the state and the power of some companies may always exceed the power of the geeks we are, and our ability to build and spread those technologies. We may also need, while we are building those technologies, laws and tools that will be in the hands of citizens, to be able to control what is being done with technology, if not always in real time, and to be able to sanction those that use technology in an unethical way and in a way that violates citizens' privacy. Julian, I want to look at what I see as a difference between a US cypherpunk perspective and the European perspective. The US Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. Just recently I was watching some footage that a friend shot in the US on the right to bear arms, and above a firearms store was a sign saying, "Democracy, locked and loaded." That's the way that you ensure that you don't have totalitarian regimes. People are armed, and if they are pissed off enough then they simply take their arms and they retake control by force. Whether that argument is still valid now is actually an interesting question because of the difference in the types of arms that has occurred over the past 30 years. We can look back to this declaration that codemaking, providing secret cryptographic codes that the government couldn't spy on, was in fact a munition. We fought this big war in the 1990s to try and make cryptography available to everyone, which we largely won. Jacob, in the West. Julian, in the West we largely won, and it is in every browser, although perhaps it is now being backdoored and subverted in different kinds of ways. The notion is that you cannot trust a government to implement the policies that it says it is implementing, and so we must provide the underlying tools, cryptographic tools that we control, as a sort of use of force, in that if the ciphers are good no matter how hard it tries, a government cannot break into your communications directly. Jacob, the force of nearly all modern authority is derived from violence or the threat of violence. One must acknowledge with cryptography no amount of violence will ever solve a math problem. Julian, exactly. Jacob, this is the important key. It doesn't mean you can't be tortured, it doesn't mean that they can't try to bug your house or subvert it in some way, but it means that if they find an encrypted message, it doesn't matter if they have the force of the authority behind everything that they do, they cannot solve that math problem. This, though, is the thing that is totally non-obvious to people that are non-technical, and it has to be driven home. If we could solve all of those math problems, it would be a different story and, of course, the government would be able to solve those math problems if anyone could. Julian, but it just happens to be a fact about reality, such as that you can build atomic bombs, that there are math problems that you can create that even the strongest state cannot break. I think that was tremendously appealing to Californian libertarians and others who believed in this sort of democracy locked and loaded idea, because here was a very intellectual way of doing it, of a couple of individuals with cryptography standing up to the full might of the strongest power in the world. So there is a property of the universe that is on the side of privacy, because some encryption algorithms are impossible for any government to break, ever. There are others that we know are extremely hard for even the NSA to break. We know that because they recommend those algorithms be used by US military contractors for the protection of top-secret US military communications, and if there was some kind of backdoor in them, soon enough the Russians or the Chinese would find it, with severe consequences for whoever made the decision to recommend an insecure cipher. So the ciphers are fairly good now, we're pretty confident in them. Unfortunately, you can't be confident at all in the machine that you're running them on, so that's a problem. But that doesn't lead to bulk interception, it leads to the targeting of particular people's computers. Unless you're a security expert, it's very hard to actually secure a computer. But cryptography can solve the bulk interception problem, and it's the bulk interception problem which is a threat to global civilization. Individual targeting is not the threat. Nevertheless, I have a view that we are dealing with really tremendously big economic and political forces, as Jeremy said, and the likely outcome is that the natural efficiencies of surveillance technologies compared to the number of human beings will mean that slowly we will end up in a global totalitarian surveillance society. By totalitarian I mean a total surveillance, and that perhaps there will just be the last free living people. Those who understand how to use this cryptography to defend against this complete, total surveillance, and some people who are completely off-grid, neo-Luddites that have gone into the cave, or traditional tribespeople who have none of the efficiencies of a modern economy and so their ability to act is very small. Of course anyone can stay off the internet, but then it's hard for them to have any influence. They select themselves out of being influential by doing that. It's the same with mobile phones. You can choose not to have a mobile phone but you reduce your influence. It's not a way forward. Jeremy, if you look at it from a market perspective, I'm convinced that there is a market in privacy that has been mostly left unexplored, so maybe there will be an economic drive for companies to develop tools that will give users the individual ability to control their data and communication. Maybe this is one way that we can solve that problem. I'm not sure it can work alone, but this may happen and we may not know it yet. Julian, cryptography is going to be everywhere. It is being deployed by major organizations everywhere, edging towards networked city-states. If you think about communication paths on the internet, fast transnational money flows, transnational organizations, interconnections between subparts of organizations, all those communication flows go over untrusted communications channels. It is like an organism with no skin. You have organizations and states blurring into each other, each network of world influence competing for advantage, and their communications flows are exposed to opportunists, state competitors, and so on. So new networks are being built up on top of the internet, virtual private networks, and their privacy comes from cryptography. That is an industrial power base that is stopping cryptography from being banned. If you look at the BlackBerry phone for example, it has a built-in encryption system for use within the BlackBerry network. Research in Motion, the Canadian company that runs it, can decrypt the traffic of regular users and it has data centers in Canada and the UK, at least, and so the Anglo-American Intelligence Sharing Alliance can get at the world's BlackBerry to BlackBerry communications. But big companies are using it in more secure ways. Western governments were fine with this until it spread beyond corporations and to individuals, and then we saw exactly the same hostile political reactions as we saw in Mubarak's Egypt. I think that the only effective defense against the coming surveillance dystopia is one where you take steps yourself to safeguard your privacy, because there's no incentive for self-restraint by the people that have the capacity to intercept everything. A historical analogy could be how people learned that they should wash their hands. That required the germ theory of disease to be established and then popularized, and for paranoia to be instilled about the spread of disease via invisible stuff on your hands that you can't see, just as you can't see mass interception. Once there was enough understanding, soap manufacturers produced products that people consumed to relieve their fear. It's necessary to install fear into people so they understand the problem before they will create enough demand to solve the problem. There is a problem on the opposite side of the equation as well, which is that programs that claim to be secure, that claim to have cryptography in them, are often frauds, because cryptography is complex, and the fraud can be hidden in complexity. So people will have to think about it. The only question is in which one of the two ways will they think about it. They will either think, I need to be careful about what I say, I need to conform, the whole time, in every interaction. Or they will think I need to master little components of this technology and install things that protect me so I'm able to express my thoughts freely and communicate freely with my friends and people I care about. If people don't take that second step, then we'll have a universal political correctness, because even when people are communicating with their closest friends they will be self-censors and will remove themselves as political actors from the world. Audiobook presented by the Learner's Library. Please like, comment, share and subscribe.